everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our 7th Friday dialogue of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Policy Research and International Studies at the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Baroda in Vadodara. We are a new institute. We are trying to focus on these two core areas that have been given to us: international studies, international affairs, strategic affairs on one side, and public policy. By policy research, obviously, we mean public policy in all its dimensions: economic, social, etc. Since we are still at an early stage, we haven't really got to the stage of where we could be able to do lots of publications and research work, though that has also started. But as you know, in writing, in doing research and writing good papers takes time. In the meantime, we are going ahead with this. In addition to our Friday dialogue, we started doing a monthly book discussion also. We've had the first discussion we had on the Indus. The second discussion would be on Kashmir, the other side of the LOC. We'll do that in a book written by Dinkar Srivastava, former diplomat. This we shall be doing in the month of August. We've done that already. Now, today's Friday dialogue, the speaker is Dr. Dipankar Das Sengupta, Professor of Economics at the Jammu University. He's a very solid economist, also thought-provoking. And the reason I thought that he would make a very good mix for us, a very good input he could add to us, is because he combines not just pure economics, but he brings in a lot of public policy element to it. As you can make out from the topic itself, it's about the sustainability of public investment. The word public is very misleading when it comes to schools. A public school means a private school in this country, paradoxically. But when it comes to public investment, we mean actually government investments. So the government is acting on behalf of the public. The government collects taxes and through personal devolution gives it to states. It's not that the money is owned by the federal government, the union government. It acts on behalf of everybody else. Either spends it itself, making highways and other things, or as devolution of the Finance Commission goes to the states. How many states are always complaining about money being received more or less. And I had done a back of the envelope calculation years ago when I realized that Kashmir, the then state of Jammu Kashmir, at 1% of India's population, got an extraordinarily high share of public resources, extraordinarily high share. And therefore, it's only fair that this is something that we should really look at very carefully. It's in all our interest. We are not grudging anybody any money, but obviously, as citizens of this country, we would like to know where the money is going and how the money is being spent. Are we getting the desired outcomes? Are we not getting the desired outcomes? Or what are the distortionary factors at play that prevent the proper utilization of public resources? And that is something I think a country like India, still a very poor country. If you look at the per capita income, we are literally fairly at the bottom of 1/3 of the world's per capita income. Even though the size of the economy, we are big because, well, we are a very populous country. So I think public finances is something that should really concern all of us, concern students particularly, because it's your India. We have borrowed the India from you. It's your India that is important. And for your India to do well, public money should be allocated well and should be spent well to get the desired outcomes. With this, let me hand you over to Dr. Dipankar Sengupta. As I said, he's thought-provoking, but he's very solid and very factual. And I hope that after he speaks, you will ask him very good and very tough questions. So Dipankar, welcome again, and over to you.
Thank you, Director Sinha. Let me come to the topic straight away. The topic that I will speak on today, it's titled Trajectory and Consumption, Composition of Government Expenditure in Jammu and Kashmir, Issues in Sustainability and Productivity. Now, trajectory, I will not concentrate so much on the trajectory because very little has changed. It's been basically a flat graph, with that flat graph only becoming worse when it should actually becoming better. So what I will do is essentially fix 1 year, the last year before Jammu and Kashmir changed forever, and concentrate on what is the nature of government expenditure, what is the nature of this particular economy, where exactly are we headed, and to give you a context, I'm going to compare it with Himachal Pradesh. Now you may ask why Himachal Pradesh? For a very good reason. It's a neighboring state, and like Jammu and Kashmir, it is also a mountainous state. So I am comparing two economies which have certain similarities. Geographically, they are both disadvantaged, and therefore what goes for one should largely also go for the other. Now, I will be now sharing my screen. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yeah.
Oh,
is it the full page or can you make it bigger? It's quite big to me actually. I guess it is the full page. Okay.
It's the full
okay.
Page.
Fair enough.
Okay. So this is okay. This is what the state looks like now. I mean, as you can see, the erstwhile state was quite a large thing. The present union territory, in a sense, is less than half the area of the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir, because we always knew Ladakh was the larger area. So the area now is 42,241 kilometers, where officially the entire state is about 2 lakh kilometers, of which about 1,10,000 was in our possession. Now the bulk of it forms the union territory of Ladakh. 42,000 forms kilometer is basically Jammu and the union territory of Jammu and Kashmir. These are the districts. This is basically the physical terrain. I mean, Jammu, part of Jammu is plain, but the bulk of Jammu actually is hilly. And the valley of Kashmir actually is quite plain. Kashmir area-wise is not very large, and the bulk of the area of Kashmir actually quite plain. The valley is quite plain. Mountains are there on the side, but when it comes to how mountainous a particular region is, it is Jammu that is more mountainous than Kashmir is. Okay, let us ask the question again. Why do governments spend money? You know, I mean, why can't we all leave it to the private sector? There are a number of reasons as to why the government spends money, because in certain sectors, the market fails. For examples, when it comes to security, when it comes to infrastructure, there are externalities associated with these goods and services, which are best, therefore, provided by the government. The government can tax us all and provide this. Otherwise, there will be a free rider problem with each agent trying to provide less than what he actually receives for this particular service. Number one. Then there are certain goods like merit goods. I mean, I can pay for my education, but it is accepted that education, health, etc., again, are best taken up by the state, or should be taken up by the state as a moral value, as a moral judgment, so that one of the goals of human development in a sense are met. And then there are social security nets, etc. So the goods that are provided by the state are both means and ends. They serve a functional purpose, but they're also goals in themselves. Now, what do I mean when I come to sustainability of government finance? Very simple. In the long run, the money spent by the state government should enable the creation of a productive economy. So I must spend on certain things, which in turn draws in investment, as a result of which GDP increases, and the taxes that arise from that increased GDP goes to pay for the increased government expenditure. The very simple concept of sustainability of government finances. Now, there are technical terms as well. Let us abjure ourselves from the technical terms and ask ourselves whether the government finances or the government expenditures undertaken by the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir or the erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir were actually sustainable. In a sense, did they give rise to a productive economy, an increasingly productive economy, from which taxes would arise and therefore liquidated? Because there's a point raised by Shakti Sinha, where he said that Jammu Kashmir receives a lot of money from the central government per head. Per se, there are reasons as to why that should happen. But we have to ask ourselves the question, both for the nation at large and Jammu Kashmir specifically, that is this money being spent well? If this money is being spent well, then it would mean that in the long run, we would have to spend less and less on Jammu and Kashmir, and this monies could be diverted to some other needier states or needier communities. And it would be good for Jammu and Kashmir, which would mean that educational or employment opportunities, income opportunities of the state would actually increase. And that is where the query about sustainability comes in. Let me briefly look at the sectoral composition of Jammu and Kashmir. If you look at the sectoral composition of Jammu and Kashmir, today agriculture is, or at least 2017-18, the last year before, of course, things changed, was roughly 16% where agriculture is concerned, 27% where industry is concerned, 56% where services are concerned. Compare and contrast to 1980, then agriculture was 47, industries was 13, and services were 39.7%. But if you look at Himachal Pradesh, compare it to Himachal Pradesh, and I've given you a justification as to why it should be compared to Himachal Pradesh. For Himachal Pradesh, agriculture is 16.7%, roughly the same as Jammu and Kashmir. Industry is 41.6%, very good. Services 39.5%. Now we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it that Himachal has managed a sectoral composition that is desirable for its level of income and indeed India's level of income? If the Indian average of, if the all India composition of industries was 41.6%, India would be a pretty happy nation right now. How is it the Himachalis have managed it and Jammu Kashmir has not? Now, if you look at the trends in per capita income, the trends in per capita income for Jammu and Kashmir have been modest. Per capita income has basically grown at 4% in constant terms. Of course, in money terms, it's been much, much faster. And that has led to a certain thing which we will talk about later. Now, let us come to government finances. And I'm talking about 2018-19 because after that, of course, the world changes. Government expenditure is roughly 57% of the GSDP of Jammu and Kashmir. This is extremely high. It tells you how central it is, how central government expenditure is in the economic life of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, this was a jump from the previous year, from 49.4%.
Dipankar, sorry, can you just tell people what is GSDP?
Gross state domestic product. It's basically the counterpart for the state. You have gross domestic product for the nation. For the state, this is gross domestic product, the value of goods and services that are produced in a particular state. Okay, the state's GDP. Now, this figure jumps from 57% to 57% from 49.4%. Now, lest you think that I am basically arguing on outdated figures, I've also got you the latest figures, the figures for 2001, 2021, 22, where government expenditure is estimated to be 54%, with total government expenditure at 1,04,000 crore rupees and GSDP at 2,01,000 crore rupees. So it is not very, very different from what will happen this year, and substantially higher than what happened in 2017-18. Now, if you look at Himachal Pradesh, the figures are 27.63%. And if you look at UP, it is roughly the same. So if you take a mainstream state, or if you take a hilly state, neighboring state to Jammu and Kashmir, the figures, government expenditure divided by total GSDP is roughly the same. But for Jammu and Kashmir, it is way, way beyond the charts. Now, let us look at the trajectory of this particular ratios. If you look at government expenditures, they've been rising over time. Of course, this rise, as I've shown you on the chart, looks enormous because it's calculated in current rupees, not constant rupees. But my intention is to show you the G by Y ratio, the government expenditure by GSDP ratio. And if you look at it, it fluctuates from sometimes it's 41.8, very high, to 45, higher still, comes down to 42.3, still very high, goes to 44.5. And then, of course, the new normal seems to be 50% and above. So the old normal throughout the 2000s to 2015-16 was hovering about 40%. Now it's a jump to a new normal. Now, if you look at where the rupee comes from, there hasn't been much change. Okay, the rupee by and largely comes from central government grants. Now, this 44% should not fool you. Why? Because it is 44% of total receipts. Now, these receipts include borrowings. The capital receipts actually is borrowings. So, if you take capital receipts away, then of the total revenue receipts, central government grants are above 55% in 2018-19. They are above 60% in 2021-22. So the centrality of government expenditure is a given, and the centrality of central government assistance in the state expenditure is also given. Now, if you look at where the finance rupee goes, now many states would be envious of this. Why? Because if you look at it, capital expenditure is 26% of the total spending. This is a dream for most state governments. For Himachal, it is something like 10% or 11%. UP, it is like something like 14 to 15%. 26% is a dream. And this year, it is estimated to be 37%. But then 37% has to be seen because this is an estimate. Because the previous year, they had quoted or planned for a similar figure, 34%, it came down to 27%. Now, they being COVID and lockdown and all that sort of a thing, things changed. But this time they are planning for 37%, which is actually pretty big. Now, 26% is not just a 2018-19 specific thing. If you look at the trajectory of government expenditure, from 2001, 2002 onward, this has been the case. Capital expenditure as a ratio of total expenditure has been very high, and total government expenditure as GSDP, proportion of GST also has been very, very high. So all in all, capital expenditure in the state of Jammu and Kashmir has always been very, very high. And I'm showing you the basically receipts for Jammu and Himachal Pradesh. The government is not that generous with central government assistance to Himachal Pradesh. And Himachal Pradesh on paper does not spend so much on capital as Jammu and Kashmir does. Now, again, this is the problem. Basically, when I prepare a PPT, I prepare it for a PowerPoint projector, not cell phones, etc. But I'll read out. What has Jammu Kashmir got to show for it? We are spending so much. What have we got to show for it? Now, if you look at per capita income, India's per capita income in 2019-20 in thing was 1,34,000 rupees. If you look at Himachal, it was 1,90,000 rupees. And if you look at Jammu and Kashmir, it is barely above 1 lakh. Jammu Kashmir is ranked 26th when it comes to per capita income. Again, this is again a larger graph, so you should be able to see Himachal figures as well as Jammu and Kashmir figures. Jammu Kashmir ranks 26th. Per capita income is 1 lakh. Himachal ranks 16th. Per capita income is 1,90,000 rupees. Overall literacy rate, Jammu Kashmir ranks lower than Himachal Pradesh. Jammu Kashmir is 77.3, Himachal is 86.6, but it must be admitted, it's an improvement compared to what Himachal Pradesh was about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It's a remarkable improvement. Social life, life expectancy, again, I'm sorry, I'll read it out for you. If you look at Jammu and Kashmir's life expectancy, it's 72.6 years, which is much, much higher than the national average of 67.9 years, and slightly higher than Himachal Pradesh, which is 71.6 years. So when it comes to life expectancy, Jammu Kashmir actually does well. Poverty rates, Jammu and Kashmir is 10.35%. If you look at Himachal Pradesh is 8.06%. So Jammu Kashmir does better than the national average, but again below Himachal Pradesh. Sex ratios, not very good. Let me read this out for you. In 2011, the child sex ratio for Jammu and Kashmir was 862 per thousand, which actually was a drastic fall from 941 in the 2001 census. Himachal Pradesh does better. It's 909 in 2011. It is up from 896 in the previous census. So on this particular parameter, again, Himachal Pradesh does better. Now let's come to hard infrastructure, because capital expenditure refers to hard infrastructure. And the two hard infrastructure parameters I want to take are roads and power, because they are paramount when it comes to increasing productivity of investment in any setting. Now, if you look at the total length, surface length of state highways in Jammu and Kashmir, then, and these are figures up to 2017, they are from basically the Ministry of Roads survey. So Himachal Pradesh, total state highways is 827 kilometers, Jammu Kashmir is 130 kilometers. Look at the figures. 827, Jammu Kashmir is 130. Now, one area of improvement is district roads, where Jammu and Kashmir has gone ahead when it comes to district roads. 11,000 kilometers as compared to Himachal Pradesh's 2,800 kilometers. But here is the only place where it outstrips Himachal. Let us come to some important things. Rural roads. Himachal Pradesh has 49,631 kilometers of rural roads. Jammu Kashmir has 28,922 kilometers of rural roads. And rural connectivity is extremely important. Let us look at the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana roads. Again, Himachal Pradesh is far ahead of Jammu and Kashmir. 17,774, 14,881. If you look at the length of rural roads built by the state, PWD, etc., Himachal again is far, far ahead. 30,000 kilometers, Jammu and Kashmir is 11,272 kilometers. You look at the various kinds, this WBM is basically the various kinds of macadam, BTs, bitumen, CCs, concrete surface, etc. In all the parameters, Himachal Pradesh is far, far ahead of Jammu. Can you hear me? I was muted.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
So, if you look at the length of urban roads, now remember, urban roads is extremely important. Much of the value addition in states in India basically takes place in urban areas. Much of your GDP is generated in urban areas. And therefore, urban connectivity, urban roads is extremely important. Let us look at urban roads, Himachal Pradesh. Total roads, 3,489 kilometers. Jammu Kashmir is roughly half, 1,757 kilometers. Let us look at the municipal roads. Again, Himachal Pradesh is 1,846 kilometers. Jammu Kashmir is 441 kilometers. Let us look at power generation capacity. Now, power generation capacity, you may argue, has nothing to do with state finances for a very simple reason. Central government also basically invests. Now, I might warn you, by and large, the capacity installed in Jammu and Kashmir is basically central government installed. The state government has a very small role, either alone or in partnership. Whereas in Himachal Pradesh, the state government has entered into a lot of partnerships with private sector players. Now, let us look at installed capacity. The total installed capacity for Himachal Pradesh when it comes to renewables Hydel is 9,800 megawatts and other is 963 megawatts. So 10,000 megawatts. That's Himachal Pradesh. For Jammu and Kashmir, it's 3,360 in Hydel, 205 in other renewables, it's 3,564. Whereas the Chenab Valley has a hydel potential of 20,000 megawatts. So all in all, this is woefully underutilized. So you don't have hard infrastructure, although you seem to have spent a lot of money into investing in this hard infrastructure. Now you may ask where this money goes. So let me give you a hint where this money goes. The GSDP of Himachal Pradesh is more than Jammu and Kashmir. Per capita incomes are more than Jammu and Kashmir. Look at the state-wise sale of vehicles. For a state whose per capita income is less than the national average, for a state whose GSDP is less than Himachal Pradesh, this state is purchasing almost twice as much of vehicles as Himachal Pradesh is doing. Where is this money coming from? And I could give you other statistics as well. This is basically a humorous aside. If you look at real estate, the proportion of real estate as total percentage of GSDP in Jammu and Kashmir, it is double the national average. If you look at land prices, urban land prices in Jammu and Kashmir, and compare it to, say, Punjab or any other state, those states will be blushing. So this is a hint as to tell you, which tells you where this actually money goes. Now the other thing, the state of skills. Now these are the various sectors. You see, it is true that all of these sectors may not be of interest to Jammu and Kashmir. So agriculture and allied services, yes, I am interested in this. But if you look at the proportion of people who are there, most of them are only minimally skilled. And the potential in Jammu and Kashmir is high value, high skill agriculture. It's not your normal agriculture. It is value addition agriculture, which has high value and low volumes. Let us look at something else. For example, trade, hotels and restaurants, because tourism is supposed to be pretty big in Jammu and Kashmir, or has the potential of being very big in Jammu and Kashmir. There too, the majority of the people who are in this particular sector are minimally skilled. The proportion of minimally skilled actually is very, very high. So many sectors in which you would have thought Jammu Kashmir has an advantage, you have a skills problem as well. So you have a problem of infrastructure, it's not there, although you've been spending a lot of money. You have a problem of power, you have a problem of roads, and you have a problem of skills. So where has this government expenditure gone to? Now, a proportion, of course, a large proportion has gone to salaries as well. But as you saw, a large proportion also went into capital formation. Where has this capital formation been formed? There is nothing to show that capital formation has occurred. If it has occurred, but if you compare it to a particular state which seems to spend far less than you do, how come that when in comparison to that particular state whose terrain is identical to yours, that state does much, much better, and as a consequence, that state has a far more, its per capita income is higher than yours, number one, and number two, it is a far more dynamic sector, private sector. I've given you a hint where this money has gone to. Now, let me sum up, because it's already 4:35 by my clock. Fiscal sustainability requires that government expenditure enables the creation of a productive economy and hence draws in investment. So taxes raised from such an economy is supposed to pay in the long run for the expenditures incurred. This does not seem to have happened in Jammu and Kashmir. High public spending or investment has not translated into the creation of assets or skills. So both soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure are missing that make for a productive economy. The persistence of a large government sector in relation to the total economy shows that the private sector is not dynamic, and the reasons are clear. In contrast to Himachal Pradesh, government expenditure and policy is not leading to better connectivity or availability of power, both of which are necessary to draw in private investment. Nor are skills domestically available, so that even if private investment comes in, it is skilled outsiders who will be employed and not locals. And
have we lost?
Finally,
Okay.
a few pictures. You have to tell me where these pictures are from.
Kishtwar, Doda.
Actually, some of them are from Bhadarwa in Doda district. By and large, a lot of people say these photographs are from Kashmir. Actually, all of them are from Jammu. This is Punch because I happen to be the director of a campus out there. So let me end this presentation, and I think if there are questions, I'm willing to take them up. Anything that I've missed, we will take up.
Thank you. Very, very, as I told everybody at the beginning, the reason I was very keen on this talk is that, yes, we form opinions as we should. As social scientists, we should form opinions, but the opinions must be based on good facts and heavy facts, and this has been a data-rich presentation. He has hinted at things, where's the money gone, but it's obvious that, and this is the point that comes to my mind, it's more a comment than a question to Dipankar, is the fact that when you have such heavy Government of India flows, where basically if you take out the lendings, 55% are grants, a loan from Government of India, something with a state like Bihar or UP would love to get even close to that. Obviously, we'll never get it. And yet, if you look at the outcomes, they should have been right at the top of the country. They are not at the right of the country. And therefore, as somebody who studies politics more than economics, though I must say I also study economics, but I don't claim to be a master of either, is that therefore it suggests to me that the rentier class created in Kashmir has a vested interest in ensuring that the state of affairs does not improve, because once the state of affairs improves, the possibility of such heavy fund flows in the form of grants, not loans, that would change considerably. And therefore, and this is true not just of Kashmir, it's true of most conflict-ridden places, that you develop a class of people who survive. And anybody who knows parts of the Northeast, and I can see a good friend sitting and watching, though he has hidden his name as B2059, is that these things are happening across the country. And therefore, today's talk is not just about pure economics or economic development. To me, it's much more about the political economy of the country that we have chosen. So I'll stop. I'll not go further. People are here. Please raise your hands, questions. Yes, over to you. Please unmute and ask your question.
Can I have one from Professor Sen Gupta?
Yeah.
Yeah. अच्छा हिमांशु आप बोलिए तब तक चलिए.
Do you think, or rather, do you support this institutionalized form of corruption was the reason for this draining out of the resources that leads to lacking of development in Kashmir?
Okay, let me answer this, because this has to it's linked to what Shakti Sena said. You see, one of the first persons in literature to describe this was, to my sorrow, not an economist, Ajay Sahani, in the context of the Northeast, described a terror economy. Whether corruption brings in this or it is, the other way around, need not bother us. What happens is, after some time, there is a symbiotic relationship between corruption and separatism. So what the state tries to do after some time, that you basically try to create a class to take the heat out of a particular movement, etc. And you believe that you can do it by throwing money into the mouths of these particular persons. Now, what happens is the following: for some time after the initial violence is brought down by state power, you think that you have something going on, where increasing number of people are basically being bought into the ambit. So you are saying, you are trying, on paper, you are showing that you are spending money on development, but actually the amount of leakages is so high, And there is so much government sanction behind these particular leakages, because anybody who tries to blackmail, in a sense, is being bought into this particular racket. So what happens is, anybody who tries to rock the boat on either side. So a principal government servant basically tries to rock the boat. He says, don't do this because we are now peaceful. Somebody from outside, the opposition, a new separatist, wants to rock the boat. Others tell him, please don't rock this particular boat. You know, this is paying for us. So for some time, this equilibrium appears to be stable. But what it does, this equilibrium is an unproductive equilibrium. It does not create jobs. And those who are outside feel frustrated, angry, and cheated, and rightly so. Because you may sell the idea of India as being an inclusive democratic polity, but the state that you create by means of pouring of finances is anything but inclusive. If you are a part of that cabal, you are pretty rich. If you are outside that cabal, you are completely excluded. So what you do is to postpone the explosion for another day. And that is exactly what happened. Now, why that explosion happened, these things are incident-ridden. But the fact that explosion occurred means that your strategy of bribing certain people by throwing good money after bad, it did not work out. It did not work out here. It did not work out in the Northeast either. It does not pay in the long run. It does not pay in the long run. So your government expenditure, in a sense, has to promote inclusion. It cannot be a distribution for largesse. It must ensure that you create conditions that those who are willing to participate, put in effort and risk, they will be rewarded. It was not so previously. I believe the events of 2019 are meant to bring in the regime that I'm talking about.
Good. I have two more questions. I'll jump to the Northeast. Mr. Gautam Sen. Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes, I've unmuted myself. Yeah, it was a very, very interesting lecture, talk, and I found it all the more enriching when I compared with my experience in the other special category states of the Northeast. Actually, now one point I had is, you see, central agencies or instruments like the NHPC, they had played a part in the infrastructure development, power development. Now, point is, what could have been done better in the past 2 decades in regard to their activities? On that, perhaps Professor Sengupta may like to say something.
You see, NHPC went out there to generate power. And as a PSU does in any other place, the NHPC did out there also. I don't think we should basically focus or give certain agencies the roles that. But that is not what the army is supposed to do. That is what the state is supposed to do. So if NHPC was building schools, etc., you have to ask yourself the question, why wasn't the government building these particular schools? And secondly, you have to ask the questions, now that the government is building schools, why is it that a lot of people who are also poor prefer to send their schools to private schools? The government is building hospitals today. Why is it that the government people, poor people, instead of going to those hospitals, go to Jalandhar or go to Ludhiana every time a medical emergency takes place? So first, the agency that you have slotted for this kind of activities, I believe, is not the right thing to do. They had to step in because the government was failing. It is the government that must be tasked with that particular function, and they must be tasked to do it well. I don't think there is any substitute for this, because we've tried many of these permutations and combinations. NHPC will do this, HMT will do that, and so on and so forth. It doesn't work. A government is supposed to do what the government is supposed to do, and we have to force the government to do that.
Now, before I ask Ashish to ask his question, I wonder if Dipankar was speaking from his own notes or Colonel Dilip Shapuri's notes. Colonel Dilip Shapuri has written, "Thank you, sir, for an impressive data-based evaluation. In fact, having served in Jammu Kashmir for a few years, this was my hypothesis. You've so objectively substantiated it. We've constructed school buildings with our defense stores materials, like cement, CGI sheets, etc. The army personnel were teachers in these schools. bracket teachers were only on paper to draw salaries, so the army people had to go and teach them. And used to share our meals with the school kids, just to ensure that they attended the school. Hopefully, things are changing now. And the last photo of Poonch reminded him of his wonderful tenure in the 80s. So, Dipankar, basically, your fact-based thing and Kanishipuri's experience-based thing, you can see a fantastic amount of overlap. So, Ashish, over to your question. And I hope that after that, we have some more good questions. We're having a very good session. Ashish, over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. This is Ashish Kotodia from the Department of Political Science. Sir, especially I wanted to ask you is, according to the KEG report, the total expenditure of the Jammu and Kashmir, which includes a revenue expenditure, a capital outlay, and the loan amount increased from 34,000 crore to 64,000 crore from 2014 to 2019. But sir, the over-indebtedness of the microfinance borrowers is still in deeply shaky mode. So do you believe that there should be a financial inclusiveness, and that will lead to inclusive growth and financial stability? And number two, sir, do you believe that the growth will lead to debt sustainability, or the reducing poverty, inequality, and investment on the social sector will lead to debt sustainability? And last one is that as Jammu and Kashmir, you mentioned that now is in trajectory of the double-digit growth. So it is on the SAN model or the Bhagwati model?
Okay, let me come back to this indebtedness. If you look at government, if credit deposit ratio in Jammu and Kashmir, it's actually very low. One is, in many cases, a lot of business activity is undertaken by government officials themselves. So you have a host of junior engineers, senior engineers telling me that they have hotels. So in a sense, it is financed by other means. You can guess what means. Demand for credit in Jammu and Kashmir is actually pretty low. Now, from time to time, you have these district banking boards where the DC scolds bankers for not giving credit. And the bankers listen because it's a drama that they have to undergo. The fact remains that there is no demand for credit. Why is there no demand for credit? Because attractiveness. See, I need credit if I want to invest. The question is, why should I invest? Investing in plant and machinery to set up manufacturing in Jammu and Kashmir is nonsensical. There are infrastructural problems, as I talked about. And secondly, ease of doing business in Jammu and Kashmir a few years ago was 28. Now it is 22, but it is still very bad. So under those circumstances, normal people do not have the courage to come out and basically do business in Jammu and Kashmir. Somebody like Hasib Drabu himself said, it is jihad to do business in Jammu and Kashmir. The true jihadis are the ones who do business in Jammu and Kashmir. So the fact is, I don't think there are very many borrowers in Jammu and Kashmir. So indebtedness per se in Jammu and Kashmir is not a problem. Now the question is, what kind of growth do I want? I want a Bhagwati kind of growth. Look, sense kind of growth I don't understand. I mean, it sounds nice. We can all dance Kumbaya, but the fact remains that, it is at the end of the day, private sector investment that basically leads to growth. And if that does not happen, then I'm afraid history is replete with examples, nothing will happen. I hope that answers the question.
Such a provocative presentation, and with 84 people attending, some have dropped out, of course. I want to see more questions. I'm sure that Ayushi, why don't you ask a question? Professor Ayushi Ketkar.
Okay,
Thank you,
please
sir.
ask the
Thank you.
question.
Yes, thank you, sir. I just wanted to know, will things change after dilution of 370? Do you think there's going to be improvement with greater democratization? Will this even show up in the economic sphere? And how do you think the Gupkar gang will react to this entire scenario now that there'll be auditing of the J&K Bank and the grants that are given to Jammu and Kashmir?
Okay, two things, Ayushi. I mean, there are certain things. This dilution of Article 370. Let me talk about Article 370 very briefly. Article 370 has not been diluted. Article 370 told you, among other things, how to apply the constitution to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Today, using that article, you have applied the full constitution to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So what has happened is Article 370, in a sense, has been sealed. It has not been diluted. It has found its full expression, period. And let us not talk about neutering of Article 370, diluting of Article 370. No, nothing of that sort has happened. The logical conclusion of an article has been met. Read the article, for heaven's sake. Okay, now I've got that off my chest.
Let's talk economics. Let's talk economics.
Okay,
now that you made your political point, let's talk economics.
Will things change? I hope they do. For example, right now, I can see a massive stress on infrastructure. Good. How do I know this? Because the proportion of government spending on infrastructure is rising. But you may argue it was high before, it translated to nothing. It is higher still. They had targeted for above 35% in the previous fiscal year. Because of COVID, that target was not met, but it was still higher than the previous years. And now it is 37%. Fantastic target. And by all accounts, and if you now look at the PWD statistics, the amount of roadways that are being added now seem to be much, much faster than what was going on prior to this. Now the question is the following. That's one aspect. The other aspect is the reform of the private sector, the power sector. And I'm told that power, in a sense, is being privatized. Good. I mean, how it plays out is another matter. The two more things, ease of doing business, number one, and the other thing is economic strategy. Look, ease of doing business is something that people are working on. Hopefully, certain things will happen out there. But strategy, you must remember, Jammu Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh are both high-cost economies. How do high-cost economies compete? They do not. They seek out niche areas where they face little competition. If you look at Switzerland, Switzerland does not manufacture steel, etc., plastics. It basically seeks out knowledge-intensive items, high value, low volume, and therefore establishes a niche out there. Can Jammu and Kashmir do it? It has. It has the cultural resources to do it. It has the natural resources to do it. So it can do a lot of things. So far, you see, there is an industrial policy, but I'm not yet sure what has been done to get us onto that particular path. So on certain things, I'm hopeful. On certain things, I really don't know. Because I believe the communication that the UT government should have had with chambers of commerce and civil society on this has not occurred. But again, let us re-examine this. All this has happened in the atmosphere of COVID. Everything, in a sense, is shut down. So when you extended the Constitution of India to Jammu and Kashmir, you had to lock down for security purposes. When you started to lower the lockdown, you ran into COVID. So let things become better. And I think in the full light of day, we will probably realize what has been done and what is being planned. So let me end out here. Where
I think you answered not just the question raised by her, but also the question by Sajid Ahmed, which is, sir, the way forward for improving existing scenarios like terrorism, etc., through with respect to economic policy. And you made the point that in a high-cost economy like Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir, you would need to look for niche. The Switzerland example is very good. You get the steel, but you do the high-end engineering products where knowledge is required, where skills are required. And therefore, you're negating the high cost by getting in the high end of the world. That's a very good way to look at it. We have a question from Dr. Jaina, and I see one more hand. So Dr. Jaina first.
Good evening, everybody. So first, I congratulate Dr. Dipankar Sengupta for giving a very good presentation. He has given the brief contour of the presentation, how the Jammu and Kashmir is actually doing. So I have some suggestion and comments, and then I'll ask I'll pose 1-2 questions.
No, you don't have so much time. Dr. Jaina, you have to be a little fast.
Yeah,
You
okay, I'll
cannot
take.
speak
Okay,
for
I'll
5
take 2
minutes.
minutes. Okay, I'll take 2 minutes. That as I know that because I'm working for last 10 to 12 years from in Jammu and Kashmir. So even if the Jammu and Kashmir that composition are same, but in Himachal Pradesh you can see lot of pharma company they are working. That is the major reason why that Himachal Pradesh is doing good, and the climate, the investment climate in in Himachal Pradesh is far better than Jammu and Kashmir. That you need to understand. And my only question is that according to Professor Sengupta, what the government should do with reference to to eradicate these corruptions in J&K, because that is the major hurdles why that growth is not happening. And the second major hurdle is that here the people are getting lot of scheme which is like a very vote banking scheme. That's why they are not working, and that's why government, instead of giving them, government should create job and government should skill them. How the government can stop this type of called popularized scheme? So these two things, I think, how the government should do actual roadmap for that.
Second
Thank
one
you.
is more important, I guess. The first one is the philosophical question of how to reduce corruption. That we can have a session on it, but if Pankar wants to touch it, I'm fine, because I have one more question I can see.
Dr. Sinha, can I add to that question?
Okay, Pooja, go ahead.
First of all, it was a wonderful presentation, and thank you, sir, for dragging me to this presentation. I'm very grateful, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I teach at Jamia Millia Islamia University, and my question is again a more socio-political question, which is, it's very hard to beat the narrative expressed by the people of Jammu and Kashmir, particularly students who tend to exhibit the fact of India versus Kashmir. So whenever they come to Delhi, they say we're going to India and now we're going to Kashmir. Also, the narrative is in the hands of the elite, again, so-called elites who are privileged and also anti-government. So yes, they have a big share in the corruption and the bad money. However, outside globally, the same narrative is going forward. So no matter what the government does, and yes, the lockdown, which was imposed after the abrogation of 370, was very essential, but it was seen as an over-dominance of the state. Now, how does the government tackle that narrative? Because I have seen it personally, that there is always this thing that, India, it's seen as an outsider, and whatever is happening in Kashmir or Srinagar is absolutely wonderful. That's my question, to add to the question.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Pooja Paswan.
This narrative, in a
So
sense,
Dr. Jaina and Dr. Paswan have asked you good questions. The Pankar, please go ahead.
this narrative is being challenged. I mean, I remember there was a time when people get defensive whenever people raise the plebiscite issue. When people started to look at the literature, started to look at data, started to look at law, you have now an entire class of people, very active in social media circles, just demolishing these particular arguments. And the former dominance of this particular lobby, which sold Kashmir, and I dare say they sold it like ghouls, their dominance in a sense is gone. They now only speak among themselves, they speak at others. I know in social media, whenever there is a debate, I have no doubt as to who wins that particular debate and who comes back second. Right now, I think even our diplomatic efforts have been pretty well done. I think as of now, the global community, and at least the official global community, diplomats, governments, accept what the government of India says. Okay, that previous climate of terror in which a lot of these intellectuals invested in a sense, is paying very badly for them. So that social sanction that they gave to terrorism, to the extirpation of an entire community from the valley, that is all now coming back to hound them, to haunt them. So I don't believe anybody really accepts this particular thing anymore. Data makes it very, very clear that the people who complained the most were actually the greatest beneficiaries of government largesse. So I think that particular credibility in a sense is gone. That's a political question, so I think let me end up.
It is political. Rais, you have a question, please go ahead. And then we'll take the written questions and end the matter. Yes, Rais.
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Am Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Sir, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this informative lecture. Being a Kashmiri, I have certain issues though that are not good, I think, for this platform. But
Rais, can you speak up? I can't hear you.
am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are
You're
audible.
audible, but because Jammu is far away in Jammu, he can't hear it.
No. Presently,
No,
sir,
mazak kar rahe hain. Just joking.
I am in Gandhinagar, Gujarat right now.
Go ahead.
Okay, sir. So my question is regarding the simple query, just the previous question that Pooja Paswan asked. I think, does you think that it took almost 70 years for the people from India or center to realize that, okay, whatever is happening in Kashmir, it is totally unconstitutional. We can just abrogate the Article 737 if you want to answer that. That is my simple question. I don't want to get into the details of that. Second thing that I want to ask is like, you were telling or you were giving some inputs about low volume and high value products. And I think in Kashmir, we have our own sericulture, saffron, apple, and almonds. But presently, if we compare the rates of our apple, because I come from that background, saffron, even sericulture, like that is banned almost in Jammu and Kashmir. So how do you compare the rates from 2011 to 2020 right now? Because the apple is the main right now. Agriculture products. If we go into the agriculture products, apple is the main product that we export from, and to some extent saffron. But the rates from the previous years, 2011 to 2020, they are almost common. Like the rates we used to get during 2011-12, we get the same rates right now throughout India. And that is the one problem when it comes to the growth or economy of Jammu and Kashmir. So second thing is, it is just a query that right from 2008, like this new system of like opposing the military, opposing the system in our state, Jammu and Kashmir, it started, second wave of it started in 2008, because it was somehow it was like neutralized during 2001-2002 phase when Mufti came to power. But it again started in 2008, and we were like drawn into those curfews and again those strikes in 2011, 2015, 2018, then 2019, 20, and the list goes on. So how do you think that this affects the economy of Jammu and Kashmir in large? Because we have just seen 1 year of this lockdown in rest of the world, and the economy is like crashed. But I think this is another issue that we have to look into when we like discuss the economy, the growth of economy in Jammu and Kashmir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Before you answer, I'll just add a point very quickly, and we have some points. I'm running out of time. You know, Rais,
yes, sir.
When I first went to Kashmir in the early 90s,
yes, sir.
So I saw a lot of new houses coming up in Hyderpura,
yes, sir.
When you drive from the city, right?
Yes, sir.
And I asked people, lots of economic activities. They said, no, nice. Pehle we had to go to the middleman to sell in Delhi. Now we're selling it directly. So all the rents the middlemen were capturing, they're getting it ourselves. So terrorism in one sense can work both ways also. But yes, it is very disruptive. There's no doubt about it. I would request Dipankar don't get into the politics of 370 and 70 years. I think we can go on and on. You can just address how does not just terrorism, but the disruption called the civil disobedience, what impact did it have on the economy? If you would quickly address it.
You see, when it comes to apple cultivation, we saw stain pulting would cease the moment the time for the harvest came. I don't think apple cultivation, at least for the last 10-15 years, has been affected by the violence. Problem with the apple cultivation and horticulture cultivation in Jammu and Kashmir is the following: is low productivity. If you look at the productivity of Jammu and Kashmir, say with Italy, China, it's nowhere. So one way of raising incomes is essentially by putting in new productivity, new techniques. Most of these orchards are senile. You know, productivity is not just low, it has now started to fall. So you have to basically change that, number one. Number two, add value to fruit. The bulk of the apple that is grown in Jammu and Kashmir is exported raw to Punjab, and the Punjabis add value to it. Compare and contrast what the Himachalis do. The Himachalis add value to their fruit. You go to any station, you will see HPMC stalls selling apple juice. Nothing from Jammu and Kashmir. So when horticulture is concerned, you need new technologies, and there are some people who are doing it, Aurangzeb, Khurram, etc., etc. You see, this basically leads to the role of agricultural universities in Jammu and Kashmir. PAU, HAU, Punjab Agricultural University, and Haryana Agricultural University have played a yeoman's role in sustaining green revolution in Punjab and Haryana. In contrast, the Sher-e-Kashmir universities of science and technology have not been able to do this. They were built to do this. They were not able to do this. So you need to increase productivity. You need to add value to fruit. You need to brand. And unless you do that, nothing's going to happen. I believe troubles, political troubles, have not affected apple cultivation. Yes, they may affect the manufacturing of juice and etc., etc., but raw apple production, it has not affected.
Obviously, investments will suffer. When your civil disobedience of the sort that you mentioned rise, investments will suffer, then therefore employment will suffer. Absolutely. But I think a very valid point made is you cannot make money from the raw product itself. It's value addition that changes everything. An apple jam or apple wine or cider, etc. They are where the real money is. Of course, many of the apple pieces are really very low end, so you're not getting money. There are many questions, but I don't have time for it. I would just like you to end Dipankar.
Yeah.
Can Ladakh become a state? Can Jammu become a state? I don't think so. We'll get into that.
No.
And we hope that Ladakh does become Ayushi a sustainable economy. Manish, too long a question to answer about the nascent frameworks. But yes, the one point I would like you to address very quickly is on the overstaffing of government employees in Jammu Kashmir, more government jobs, which is a burden of the exchequer, and therefore less money available for development works. I think that is a point only. We really don't need a question in that. I think we'll agree on that. So I think we've had a very, very educative, informative, thought-provoking, gainful. I'm only reading from what our listeners have been writing. Session. It's been wonderful. The questions have been very, very good. I'm sorry we could not take more of them, because all the good questions are coming at the end. I don't know why we wait for the end. But yes, we will definitely not talk about the constitutional validity. Article 370 has not been abolished, Dr. Sandhu. Let's remember that. It is very much on the statute books even today, as Dipankar has also explained. So we'll leave it at that. All I can say is, Dipankar, it's been a very good session. As I said at the beginning, if we have data-rich sessions where you can analyze, so I can disagree with you, your opinions, but my disagreement should be based on facts, not my gut feeling. And if you see the amounts of public exchequer involved, I think it is a question should be raised primarily by the people of Jammu Kashmir itself. Why is it that despite so much of public investment in the state and now UT, our outcomes are not good enough? Why aren't our education levels, our per capita income? Why has this capital formation not led to investment, private investment that would create employment? And these are very, very valid policy questions. And we hope that with this talk, people would feel motivated enough to ask these questions as citizens of the whole country, as residents of Jammu Kashmir, and as concerned people in any case of society. After all, the money is our money. Worse, because it's deficit financing, this money actually belongs to the next generation. So we are borrowing from the next generation. We at least should prepare a better world for the next generation. So I must thank our lovely audience. We've had a fantastic audience who've kept up till the end. I mean, normally by now 30% have gone, but only 5-6 people have gone till now. That's a tribute, I think, to how rich the discussions were, how thought-provoking it was, and so factual it was. So Dipankar, thank you very, very much. Thank you, audience. Many people are thanking you. I can see Ravi Ocha, RP Ocha thanking you. Many people have thanked you. Shivani is thanking you. So I won't take any more names. Somebody will say my name is left out. Many, many names are there. Please read them before I cut it out. And anybody wants a copy of the note, please ask us. We'll request Dipankar to share the note with us.
I've already sent it.
Okay. And the e-certificate, again, to repeat it, is office-apris, AIPRIS, at msubaroda.ac.in. I repeat, office-apris, AIPRIS, at msubaroda.ac.in. We shall meet again next Friday. And next Friday, who is speaking? Dr. Harsh Pant is speaking on the New World Order. and India. So I'm sure that will be an equally fascinating session,
एक काम
but from a
करो,
completely different perspective.
एक second,
Yuvraj, abhi nahi. Let me end up. So thank you very, very much. All of you who attended, and we hope to see you again next Friday. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dipankar. Thank you, all of you.